Hi, I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and the lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, please visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking with Aaron Cooper, Vice President of Global Policy at BSA, to discuss ICT supply chain security. Aaron leads BSA's global policy team, working on issues such as data privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, and international trade. Aaron previously served as Chief Counsel for Intellectual Property and Antitrust Law for Chairman Patrick Leahy on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. So Aaron, thanks so much for joining us today to share your thoughts on the topic of ICT supply chain security, where BSA is a thought leader. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an incredibly important issue and really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you today.
Great. So let's start with an overview of the issue. What is ICT supply chain security, and why is this an issue that BSA cares about?
Well, at the outset, just think about what it means when we interact with technology in the digital economy every day. We are dealing with the software that is what the consumer might interact with. The software is communicating through hardware to a platform. The platform software is communicating to firmware and connected to hardware. And all of that is being developed and put together in different places around the world. The US is a leader on many of the technologies that are involved, but it takes a global supply chain in order to be able to provide the types of services that consumers expect. Our association is focused on enterprise software, but that means that companies that are using the software need to be able to secure that software that's the best in class from around the world, and it needs to be developed in a way that it takes account of the fact that we have different pieces being developed in different places around the world. In doing that, we also have to make sure that the software that's being used from the financial services industry, for the energy industry, for the health industry, is kept as secure as possible throughout the course of the life cycle of the software. And that's very important both for consumer privacy, for data security, and for making sure their economy can stay on track.
So we can't talk about cybersecurity without mentioning the Solarwinds intrusion. How does that hack affect the supply chain security discussion, and what lessons can policymakers take away from that?
I think that the discussion around SolarWinds has been an important element in highlighting, particularly on the government side, about how important it is to make sure that the software that's being developed and being deployed throughout the government, as well as in the private sector, is developed and deployed in a way that is secure, and that security is maintained throughout the life cycle of the software of the ICT device. It's a really important factor that I think 10 years ago there was not enough focus on. 5 years ago there wasn't enough focus on. But I think SolarWinds and some other recent developments over the last several years have really helped to focus both companies but also government officials on the importance of making sure that the software is not just developed initially in a way that is secure and using best practices, but that there's consideration of the entire life cycle of the product. One of the things that BSA did a few years ago was to put out a software security framework, which was designed to pick up best practices throughout the life cycle, considering the whole life cycle of the software development and software deployment. We then worked very closely with NIST and the Department of Commerce, which recently came out with its own, it's called the SSDF, that is about the life cycle of software security. And I think that one of the lessons from SolarWinds is that there's going to be a lot more focus, both in the government and in the private sector, on making sure that there's adoption of those best practices, both from the software developer side, but also from the customer side. And customers increasingly want to know that the software that they are licensing, that they're procuring, is developed and maintained in a way that is secure and reliable.
So I think that's actually a good segue, because BSA recently released a white paper on ICT supply chain security with recommendations for policymakers. So can you walk me through what you recommend in the paper?
Sure. What we did was we looked at what are the issues, particularly over the last 4 years, that have really impacted the ICT supply chain security system, and what has, in particular, the U.S. government been doing to try to address those concerns. And one of the things that we've seen, particularly over the last 4 years, was that the U.S. government's approach to ICT supply chain security was really focused on intervention and country-based limitations. So, for example, if you have part of the software is developed in a certain country, or if part of the supply chain implicates a certain country, that there might just be a blanket prohibition on the use of that software, of that ICT product or service. Mm-hmm. And there are times when that might be appropriate, and there are situations where that might be the best approach. But as a holistic matter, when we think about how are we going to protect the security of our supply chains going into the future, we really need more of an assurance-based approach. We need more of a focus on making sure that we're using best practices and that we have improved the technology that protects the supply chain over the course of the next several years. And I think one of the objectives of the ICT supply chain security paper that we released was to encourage the Biden administration to think about a transition from this interventionist-based approach to more of an assurance-based approach that would bring together partners from around the world, other governments that are like-minded, as well as industry, to try to develop what best practices look like in order to protect the supply chain, rather than taking the more blunt instrument of the interventionist approach that we've been seeing.
Right, and that's a distinction that you make in the paper about country-based limitations versus an assurance-based approach. And what do you mean when you say in the paper that current policies are overly broad? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I'll take one example that we've raised in the paper and that has come up a few times. Is there was an executive order that then President Trump issued about a year and a half ago, that empowered the Department of Commerce to have rules that basically say if there's a use of software or any ICT technology product that might implicate national security concerns, that the Department of Commerce can completely block the use of that technology. That takes such a broad scope that while there are times when it would be appropriate to prevent or prohibit the use of certain technology in certain circumstances, saying that across the board is functionally not possible for the U.S. government to implement, but it also raises concerns about what other governments might do in reaction to that policy. I think for any supply chain policy, we want to make sure that it's something that's sustainable, that's reciprocal, so that if another country adopts it, the U.S. would be okay with that treatment, and it's transparent, because if there's going to be a transaction that's blocked or a use of technology that's blocked, there should be an explanation that goes along with that.
So what do you think should be built into the U.S. supply chain strategy going forward?
I think the key is that the U.S. government needs to think about, first, what are the horizontal across industry set of best practices that it wants to implement. I think NIST does a really good job of both advancing U.S. government policy while at the same time partnering with industry and academics in order to produce best practices that are implementable across industries. I think that's an important public-private partnership, part of what we put in the assurance bucket that we advocate as the way to approach ICT supply chain security. I think that's an important one. Another important one is partnering with like-minded countries to have a consistent interoperable approach, so that the approach used in Europe and the US and Japan and Australia and India and so on is consistent, and we have an understanding of when transactions might be prohibited, what types of assurance policies the different governments can accept, and how do we have interoperable baseline security requirements across the region.
So as you know, the Biden administration just released an executive order on supply chain policy, and actually international cooperation appears to be built into that. What are your expectations for how the new administration is going to proceed with the EO and handle the issue of supply chains in general?
I think so. So the supply chain EO that came out covers a broad range of topics beyond ICT, but it does touch on ICT. And one of the things that it requires is for the Department of Commerce, Department of Homeland Security to review within 100 days the landscape of ICT supply chain security policies. And I think that's an important place for the U.S. government to start thinking about how it wants to approach procurement going forward of software services and ICT services, ICT products more broadly, and the message it wants to communicate to the private sector about what those best practices should be. I think we really need to focus on making sure that there's not just how do we make sure that we secure government systems, but also how do we help customers of software services to understand what types of security vulnerabilities there might be, but also what kind of security enhancements and practices the companies that are developing and deploying software are using. And having a harmonized approach, we have it in the BSA software security framework, NIST has it in the software security development framework. Having a common language to talk about it can be really important.
Right.
I think one of the challenges that they have, and one of the things that I encourage them to focus on, is the importance of making sure that baseline security approaches, which are extremely important and need to be based on real best practices from industry, from academics, making sure that they are real, sophisticated, and reliable, are implemented across sectors. There's a risk that comes from having a fragmented approach to cybersecurity protection, where the rules for the energy industry and for the financial services industry might differ and be inconsistent from rules in other industries. And I think that one key is to make sure that across the board the same baseline applies, and where there's a necessity to have stronger security because we're talking about critical infrastructure or we're talking about certain aspects of government procurement, that those additional security requirements be built on top of that baseline in a way that is consistent and interoperates with it, so that you don't have inconsistencies that create additional vulnerabilities depending on whether the cloud service is used for one industry or another.
I think that's a really important point to make, because in the executive order, they're dividing it up by sector and by industrial base, and there are certain things, like you said, that are just cross-cutting and need to be dealt with that way.
And the importance of it being consistent. If you just have, you have individual vertical regulators going from top to bottom, everything that needs to be in the way software, for instance, or cloud services are provided or developed, then you run that risk of not being risk-based. Instead, you're thinking of it being much more prescriptive and not consistent between industries, and can create additional vulnerability.
And I'm not sure I saw the terms risk-based in the EO, and I'm not sure I saw any mention of international standards. Hopefully, those will be things that commenters, if they provide opportunities for comment, will make, because those are going to be really important.
That's a good point. I mean, risk-based is crucial almost regardless of the area we're talking about. When we talk about privacy, risk-based analysis is important. We talk about AI development, risk-based analysis is important. It's very important in supply chain security too, as is making sure that we're involved in international standard setting. As you were saying, that is an important way of making sure that there's interoperability between systems. One of the things that we recommend in our supply chain white paper is that the U.S. government take a more active role than it has recently in international standard setting development organizations, because that can be such a good way of making sure that best practices are used across countries, across regions. If we have a global supply chain, we need to make sure that the standards are really high and consistent with our best practices here.
I also wanted to ask you a bit about investment, because creating more secure supply chains also requires investment. I know that BSA has advocated for increased funding to the Technology Modernization Fund. I was wondering whether you could talk about how increased investment in tech modernization improves supply chain security.
So first, this is great timing for the question because just today, the president signed, today as we're recording this, the president signed the package that includes significant investment in the Technology Modernization Fund. And I think that's an important part of supply chain security because where we have the use of outdated equipment and outdated services, some of which might not continue to get patches or get updates, we run an increased risk of vulnerability within the U.S. government. This is a big problem at the state level as well. During COVID, as many of us have been, those of us who have been fortunate to be able to work remotely, of jobs that enable that, we are seeing a migration of a lot of really important data being stored remotely, and we're accessing data remotely. We're doing it at schools, we're doing it in the healthcare system. And at the state level, as that's happening within state government, they need to have the resources to make sure that they can keep those systems secure and the data secure. And it's been a real challenge, and we've heard from state CIOs that is a real issue. And I think making sure that they have funding to upgrade their systems and make sure that they have top of the line, state of the art cybersecurity defenses is crucial for privacy, for security, for the economy to get back on its feet.
Touched upon this a little bit earlier when we talked about standards, but what role should public-private partnerships play in supply chain security?
I think public-private partnership is really important on several levels, but a key one is we want to make sure that the U.S. government, any government, gets the benefit of input from those that are actually, in this case, developing the software or dealing with global supply chains and thinking about how to make sure they're resilient and how to implement a zero trust environment. It can't just be the private sector saying these are the practices we want you to adopt, but it also couldn't be just the government saying here's the prescriptive way that you should approach supply chain security. It really needs to be a partnership where the government is driving the policy outcomes that they're looking for, and they're taking best practices, or they're listening to best practices from what the industry does well, identifying what the industry doesn't do well, using getting academic voices, getting public interest voices. All of that can be really important. And it's something that I think NIST and NTIA both do really well at the Department of Commerce as they're developing standards and recommendations. And I think that's an important aspect of improving our system moving forward.
So one last question. Where does BSA see upcoming opportunities to engage the Hill and the administration on ICT supply chain security?
Well, certainly in the wake of SolarWinds and in other recent developments where we've seen APT attacks that have been pretty significant, there's a lot of interest both in the executive branch and on the Hill. I think we'll see much more action coming out of the administration form of executive orders on software. We certainly want to help be part of the process to identify what industry can do to be helpful to keep our supply chain secure. I think on the Hill, a few weeks ago, there were 3 or 4 hearings in a row focused on this issue. And I think we can expect to see a number of pieces of legislation focused on incident response, making sure that that companies that are providing software to the government and critical infrastructure sectors are meeting best practices. Often we see in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the authorization for the Defense Department, a lot of provisions that focus on software security, on supply chain security more generally, and I think that's a place that will look as often a leading indicator of what the government's looking to do.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Aaron, for joining us. Thanks for your leadership on this issue. Really appreciate your joining us and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate the focus that you're putting on this and the opportunity to be here and talk about it.
Excellent. So that wraps up this episode of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube where you can like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.